On March 11, 1945, the crew of the attacked aircraft carrier USS Randolph was taking a short break from combat missions when the sudden wail of an air raid siren shattered the comm. Almost instantly, the ship shook violently as a deafening explosion tore through its hull. A Japanese Yokosuka Ginga bomber, packed with nearly a ton of explosives, had slammed into the carrier's stern. In this horrific assault, claimed the lives of 27 sailors and injured 105 more, becoming one of many attacks carried out by the Kamikaze, the Imperial Japanese Navy's special suicide units, whose sole mission was to inflict maximum damage on the enemy at the cost of their own lives. In this episode, we'll explore how Japan managed to persuade thousands of young pilots to willingly sacrifice themselves for their nation and emperor, what aircraft and tactics the Kamikaze used, and who these men were, the deadly warriors who fought for the land of the rising sun. Japan's daring assault on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, led under Emperor Hirohito, marked the empire's first major triumph against the United States and the British Commonwealth. By 1942, Japan had advanced almost unhindered across Asia and the Pacific, seizing control of the Philippines, Taiwan, and Singapore. However, in the decisive Battle of Midway, American forces delivered a devastating blow to the Japanese fleet. From that point on, Japan's Navy and Air Force could no longer compete with the Allies' rapidly advancing technology. Every attack on U.S. fleets ended in catastrophic losses for the empire. By September 1944, it had become clear to Japanese command that the Allies were preparing to invade the Philippines, a territory of critical importance to Japan. In response, they devised Operation Shogo, the so-called Victory Plan. During its planning, several pilots proposed a desperate solution, one that completely dismissed any chance of returning alive. But where did such an unwavering readiness for self-sacrifice come from? The answer lies deep within Japan's history and culture. The Bushido Code, or the Way of the Warrior, had existed in various forms since the 12th century, serving as a moral and ethical guide for samurai. One of its core principles declared that it was better to die with honor than live in disgrace. From this belief arose the ancient practice of seppuku, ritual suicide performed to avoid capture or as atonement for a dishonorable act. Moreover, Japanese society had long upheld profound reverence for authority, with the emperor regarded as an arahitogami, a living deity, the embodiment of divine will. Worshipping him was considered a sacred duty for every Japanese person. In the years before World War II, the ethics of Bushido were actively promoted across Japan. Children were taught from a young age to be loyal to the emperor and to value self-sacrifice for the greater good. Long before the formal emergence of the Kamikaze units, the idea of sacrificing oneself for the nation was already well known. During the war, there were the so-called banzai charges, where infantrymen literally threw themselves at enemy machine guns and artillery, crying banzai as they rushed forward in devotion to their emperor. It was also in 1942 that the first suicide attacks by pilots began. Downed airmen would deliberately ram their crippled planes into enemy ships in the hope that their deaths might still do some damage. Stories of these desperate attacks spread quickly through Japanese society. Captain Motoharu Okamura, commander of the Tateyama Air Base near Tokyo, was likely the first officer to officially propose the tactic that would become known as kamikaze. A little later, in October, Japanese intelligence observed an American task force approaching the Philippines. Then, Rear Admiral Masafumi Arima led pilots in an attack and crashed his plane into the American carrier USS Franklin, inflicting serious damage. Japanese propaganda eagerly seized on this small victory, elevating the admiral as a model of patriotism and self-sacrifice. 4 days later, Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, was ordered to cover Japanese ships during the impending battle with the U.S. fleet in Leyte Gulf. With the island's air forces nearly wiped out, Onishi told officers of the 201 Air Group at a briefing, "I believe there is only one way to carry out this operation. Mount 250-kilogram bombs on Zero fighters and let them crash into American carriers." 23 rookie pilots, without visible hesitation, agreed. The suicide pilots were to fly nimble fighters, such as the Mitsubishi A6M-0, light, highly maneuverable aircraft with long range. A stripped-down version of the Zero, relieved of non-essential equipment and fitted with a quarter-ton bomb, became the kamikaze pilot's primary weapon. The dramatic debut of the kamikaze came on 25 October 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. One Zero struck the carrier Senti, while another ripped a large hole in the vessel Suwannee. Although both ships stayed afloat, their surviving crews were stunned by the unexpected and fanatical tactics of the Japanese. At the same time, the carriers Kitkun Bay and St. Lo were also attacked. St. Lo suffered the first major kamikaze success when a Japanese bomb set off a chain reaction of torpedo explosions that tore the ship apart from within. In total, 7 carriers and about 40 other ships were hit. Around this time, the attackers adopted the name we now know, Kamikaze, Divine Wind, a reference to the semi-legendary typhoon that twice saved Japan from Mongol invasions in the 13th century. Those early victories unnerved the Americans and galvanized the Japanese. Although the Allies pressed on successfully with their Philippine campaign, the propaganda-embellished attacks produced a wave of volunteers ready to give their lives for Imperial Japan. Whereas Japanese pilots early in the war had been through rigorous selection, extensive training, and intensive flight practice, the advent of kamikaze schools changed the quality of instruction dramatically. Shortages of aircraft and fuel reduced training flight hours. Kamikaze recruits learned only basic combat tactics and the weak points of enemy ships. Training also included brutal physical punishments designed to strip away a pilot's individuality and make him indifferent to inevitable death. Meanwhile, kamikaze tactics continued to evolve. A five-plane formation became standard. 3 kamikaze and 2 escort fighters meant to ward off enemy attackers. 2 approach profiles were used most often, skimming low over the sea to evade radar, but exposing the planes to heavy gunfire, or diving from altitudes up to 10,000 meters to gain high speed at the cost of more difficult aircraft control. The philosophy of the kamikaze soon spread throughout the Japanese military. By the autumn of 1944, Japan had begun mass production of the Yokosuka MXY-7 Ohka, a rocket-powered, wooden-bodied flying bomb. Released from a bomber, the Ohka was guided by its pilot toward enemy ships, carrying over a ton of explosives. Its most notable use came during the Battle of Okinawa. The Japanese Navy also had its own suicide weapons. The Kaiten, manned torpedoes packed with 1.5 tons of explosives, were intended to strike Allied vessels. However, design flaws and the extreme difficulty of controlling them rendered the program largely ineffective. Out of roughly 150 launches, only 2 managed to sink enemy ships. Beginning in October 1944, training also commenced for Shin'yō, small, motorized explosive boats carrying up to 300 kilograms of explosives. These sea kamikaze first saw action during the battles for the Philippines in the winter of 1944-45, where they sank 2 ships. Their final known deployment occurred during the Battle of Okinawa, when one succeeded in sinking a U.S. landing craft. The Imperial Army, too, developed its own ground-based version of the kamikaze. Squads of soldiers equipped with explosive backpacks who would throw themselves under enemy tanks. The Battle of Okinawa proved decisive and one of the bloodiest campaigns of the Pacific War. The island's defense was entrusted to Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, who planned to create large kamikaze units composed mostly of inexperienced pilots flying outdated aircraft. His idea was to allow American forces to advance inland, then destroy their supporting fleet through mass kamikaze strikes. The U.S. invasion began on April 1, 1945. Just 5 days later, 350 kamikaze aircraft took to the skies, sinking the destroyers Bush and Calhoun and damaging about 20 other vessels. That same morning marked the start of the ill-fated Operation 10 Go. The crew of the Yamato, the largest battleship in the world at the time, was ordered to carry out a suicide attack on the Allied fleet approaching Okinawa in an effort to divert attention from the mass kamikaze offensive. Despite strong objections from the sailors, the mission went ahead. While Yamato attacked, 114 kamikaze pilots launched their final flights. The massive assault achieved little. Only the carrier Hancock and the battleship Maryland were put out of action, and 3 other ships were damaged. On June 21, 1945, the Allies captured Okinawa, delivering a devastating blow to Japan. Yet even after that defeat, for another month, the Japanese continued to send kamikaze aircraft against enemy positions. Their final victim was the destroyer Callahan, sunk on July 28. After the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. Admiral Ugaki, unwilling to accept defeat, took off on one final mission with a handful of volunteers in a bomber, but the mission failed and he was killed. The father of the kamikaze, Admiral Takejiro Onishi, committed seppuku the day after Japan's surrender. In his final note, he apologized to the kamikaze pilots for leading them to die in vain, having failed to bring victory to their homeland. So, how effective were the kamikaze attacks? In total, they cost Japan 2,600 aircraft and 4,000 pilots. Hundreds of Allied vessels were damaged, and roughly 40 ships were sunk or put out of service, including 3 escort carriers, 15 destroyers, and 12 landing craft. While the toll was considerable, it was far from enough to change the course of the war. The image of the kamikaze has since left a deep mark on global culture, inspiring countless books and films about these fatal missions. In Japan, public opinion remains ambivalent. Most people condemn the commanders who encourage such actions, yet they honor the pilots themselves as heroes who sacrifice their lives for their country. Across Japan and the Philippines, monuments, plaques, and statues stand in their memory. But suicide attacks are not merely relics of the past. The world saw echoes of that same tragic resolve on September 11, 2001, and in ongoing acts of suicide terrorism around the globe. So what do you think drives people to willingly give up their lives for a cause or an idea?